Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really excited about continuing this webinar in English. Really, the purpose of this webinar is to set a groundwork for what inclusion means and why it's so important for us to do. So to get started, we're going to start talking about what is disability. There's a lot of different definitions about what it is and what it isn't, and mostly it's kind of a lacking definition. So I want to present a new definition. So disability in this new definition is a characteristic that is a natural part of the human condition. Thus, it is not something to pity, but rather to celebrate as part of our diverse and human experience. In the same way that we have other characteristics, such as being a woman, being from a certain country, certain preferences, it's the same way. So we don't see disability as something lacking in a person, but rather something that's natural part of the human experience that has always existed, that will continue to exist, and that we can celebrate if we put the right tools in order. If you ask a person with a disability, what's the hardest thing about having a disability? It's hardly ever the disability itself, but rather societal attitudes towards the disability and not having access to materials, education, and other resources. So keeping that idea in mind, with disability, it's really important to think about how are we thinking about disability? So if we're going off of this idea that it's a characteristic, so anybody can have a disability, and it's not something that is necessarily negative, how can we talk about it, and how can we, as educators, make sure that we are using this mentality for our students? So there's 5 modes of disability. Different people and different organizations put these into different categories. Some only do 2 or 3. I've broken it up into 5 to make it a little easier. The first mode of disability is the medical model. So it's the idea that there's a disability and it needs to be fixed. And it's something that, the person really, there's nothing they could do about it, and it's something we should pity them. It's the idea that it's something that's a horrible occurrence that happened to somebody. It's seen as lacking of able-bodied properties, and it treats individuals with pity and sorrow. This is not to say that medicine isn't good, right? Medicine is good and it helps us move forward. But if the only way that we're looking at disability is as something negative that needs to be fixed, that can be really damaging, especially as educators, because as educators, we're not doctors. It's not our job to fix a child, but rather it's our job to take the child exactly as they are and give them tools in order for them to do the best that they can in their educational setting. The next model of disability is the expert professional model. So it's the idea that there's a problem and the solution needs to be found by a professional. So in our case as educators, or when students graduate school and they become adults, that they need to follow what a professional says. It's a very authoritarian mentality where I'm the expert and I know all the answers, and so you need to just follow along with what I say. And it makes a person with a disability not an integral part of their own decision making and deciding what they want to do with their lives in the future, or just small decisions. So kind of keeping that in mind. The next model is the charity tragedy model, and all of these modes kind of interact with each other in one way or another. So the tragedy model is the idea that a disabled person is a victim of a circumstance and deserves our pity. So sometimes, people become disabled because they are in some type of accident or something happened bad. And so we stay in that mentality where we think, oh, that's so sad that it happened to you, and we're not really able to help them continue on the process of finding what they can do with their life. This model is used a lot by charities to fundraise money. So they will present the idea, especially of children, as like, oh, this poor child who is in a wheelchair or who's blind, and who, you know, please give us money so that we can help this child out. It leads to institutionalization, which is that because we feel pity for people, we don't integrate them into society. So we set them aside. It's the opposite of inclusion. They are put into institutions where they only hang out and socialize with people like themselves. And it's also very damaging to the self-worth, especially as educators. If we have this mentality that it's pitiful to have a disability, we are going to pass this on to our students. I talked about in the last webinar how there's a study done where there was a bunch of lab rats, and the main researcher wanted to find out how people interact with different intelligences and how their biases come off on the students. So they had a bunch of lab rats that the researcher labeled as highly intelligent, average intelligence, and low intelligence, and told the students this is where the rats fall in. At the same time, all of the rats were of average intelligence. None of them were above and none of them were below. What ended up happening is all of the students that worked with the rats that were labeled as lower intelligence performed lower on the task that they had to perform. And the rats that were told were higher intelligence performed higher than average. And so what this study tells us is that our implicit bias is having a huge effect on how we interact with our students and how we think about them. So if we think that our students with disabilities are going to do less or are going to not be able to persevere in different tasks, they are directly going to show us that. So it's really, really important that us as educators become aware of where our bias lies and how we can work with our students better. The next model of disability is empowering model, and so it's kind of where a lot of us as educators fall in. The professional is viewed as the service provider, so we are the ones who have the knowledge, who kind of work with the students. The individual makes decisions based on the information given. So the person with a disability, and this typically relates to adults, they take the information from the professional and then make a decision. And autonomy is the goal. The goal is that they will be independent and be able to do it on their own. And where that is fine, and that's kind of the work that a lot of us do, the goal is really the last model of disability, which is the self-empowerment model. So this model views the individual, him or herself, as the expert, because they are the ones that have the disability. They are the ones that understand their life and the experiences that they have. And they view themselves and others in the community that share the same disability as the experts, as opposed to the service provider that is giving services. So the individual makes decisions based on the information on their own. So they take the information given and they decide what to do. And sometimes it may not be the best decision. And so a lot of people say, well, we shouldn't let them make the decision because it's not always going to be the best decision. And what I come back around to is, how many people without disabilities do you know that are making the best decision? They're not. You know, a lot of us make bad decisions, and we need to let people with disabilities make bad decisions so that they are able to make those decisions regardless of how it ends up. The real difference in this model is that it views disability as a cultural, social identity. So it's not merely a medical condition like we talked about in the mode earlier, but rather a cultural identity in the way that, for example, I was born in Mexico and I'm very proud of being Mexican and kind of what that brings along with it. Society, especially in the US right now, isn't necessarily looking at Mexicans as like, oh, that's so great. But I know that in spite of the media and society thinking that that's a bad thing, I know that it's good and I'm proud of that. And so I'm blind myself, visually impaired, and so it's the same idea. I am proud of having a disability, and I know that it's a wonderful thing for myself. Society may not see it that way, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I see it as a part of my identity. And so working with students, if we kind of think in that way, it really helps bring up their self-esteem, make them feel confident about each other. It makes other students without disabilities have more confidence in the abilities of their classmates. And in this mode, praise is not given for simple tasks. So sometimes I work with a lot of students with disabilities that they are given praise for just walking in the door. And people are like, oh, you're so great, you're such an inspiration. I can't imagine what my life would be if I was like you. And so that's really damaging. We want to kind of get away from that mentality of praising for things that are not praiseworthy. If a student does something that's praiseworthy, then yes, we should definitely give them praise, but not for things that are really not, that we wouldn't praise other students for. And so it's refusing this idea of pity and this idea of seeing disability as something that we should be sad about. Okay, so now that we kind of have a framework on what disability is and how to frame it as educators, we can look at how we can do inclusion with this idea of people with disabilities kind of being able to make their own decisions and seeing disability as a characteristic. So what exactly is inclusion? There's also a lot of definitions of inclusion and how we can best incorporate that. So inclusion, according to the UN, is that all children and young people in the world with their individual strengths and weaknesses, with their hopes and expectations, have the right to education. It is not education systems that have the right to certain types of children. It is the educational system of a country that must be adjusted to meet the needs of all children and young people. So this is really important. When I work with different teachers or different schools and talking about inclusion, a lot of times I hear like, we're not prepared to work with this type of student. And while that's a legitimate concern, we should try to do as much as we can to prepare ourselves. Sometimes incorporating inclusion is more about thinking, how can we incorporate this student? Because they don't have to fit into what we're doing. We have to change the way that we're educating in order for them to be a part of it. And so I think a really good metaphor for helping us think about how to work with our students and having high expectations is this idea of a bee or a flea. So a bee is not supposed to fly. So scientists have done all this research on bees, and their wings are not strong enough to actually carry the body of the bee. Like the way the wings are made and all the physics that I don't understand, it's just made in a way that the bee should not be able to fly. But the bee doesn't know it's not supposed to be able to fly. So the bee flies, it flies anyways. On the other hand, we have a flea. So in different places, they have something that's called a flea circus. So they teach fleas to jump and turn and do these little tricks. So one of the way in which they train fleas is they put them in a bucket. And in that bucket, they put a lid. And a bee tries to jump, and it touches the lid, and it recognizes, oh, that's as high as I can jump. So then it tries to jump again, and the lid is there again, and it knows, okay, that's as high as I can jump. So once they take the lid off, the flea never jumps higher than where that lid is. They don't realize that the lid is no longer there because they've been socialized into thinking that that's as high as they will ever jump. And so this is kind of what we're doing with our students. We're setting limits on, okay, this is as high as they'll ever be able to go. And so they meet our expectations. They never go above that point. So I really want to encourage teachers to try to see your students as bees instead of fleas, and try to not put a limit on what it is that they can and cannot do. And when we do that and we have this mentality of kind of a positive philosophy on disability, we can see that our students will do a lot more than what we thought they were capable of doing. So here I'm talking about some benefits of inclusion, and there's really great research recently on inclusion and how it helps all of us. And before, the idea was that inclusion was good for students with disabilities. But the more research we do, the more research we find it's good for every single person, even those students in our classroom who do not have disabilities. And these are just some of the benefits. There's definitely more. One of the benefits of inclusion is it prepares everyone for an inclusive life. So inside of a classroom, it's really preparing students for life in every way. We're teaching them math that's going to help them. We're teaching them reading and writing skills. We're teaching them how to socialize. And when we include students with disabilities in the regular education classroom, it teaches everybody how to be part of society. So it teaches our students without disabilities how to interact with students with disabilities. I have a student who's blind, totally blind, and has been part of the general education classroom since pre-K3. So we have pre-K3, pre-K4, and then kindergarten, and then first grade. So she's now in first grade. She's had 4 years of full inclusion. And the students in her classroom are like, oh yeah, I'm going to make up a name, it's Sabrina. And they know how to interact with her. And when they see adults in their community with disabilities, they're not like, oh my gosh, what's that? What do I do? How do I interact? It doesn't become awkward. It becomes where like, oh yeah, I have a friend at school who's Sabrina, who has a disability. I can just talk to them like anybody else. And they know kind of when to help and when not to help, and making our students advocates for themselves to be able to say, I don't really need your help right now, or like, right now I want to play with you, is really important. So inclusion helps us have more students that are able to access the general education curriculum and are able to become educated. I'm talking specifically in the United States. Before we had inclusion, a lot of students were educated in kind of particular schools that were meant just for them. So like schools for the blind, schools for the deaf, schools for students that had intellectual disabilities. And really what that did is it segregated students, but also students didn't continue on to higher education. So now more than ever in the United States, students of all disabilities are continuing on to higher education, or doing better to graduate from high school. And so it's really important because they're able to access the curriculum and they feel like they're a part of something more than just people that have disabilities like them. For every single person, both people with disabilities and people without disabilities, social skills improve of all children. They learn how to interact with people. Students that don't have disabilities learn, okay, my friend, I know they have autism, for example, and I know that when they start acting like this, they don't want me to go up to them, so I know not to do that. So those skills transfer to the real world. When they are out in society, when they finish school, they're able to say, oh, okay, maybe right now I'll back away from that person and not go up to them because they're upset. So the skills are transferable to every single person, both students with and without disabilities. The next point of raised expectations. The raised expectations occur for everyone. So in an inclusive classroom, everybody is expected to do better, to do more. And the students without disabilities are not comparing themselves to students that just have the same disabilities of themselves, but rather comparing themselves with everybody. And it really, if you do it in the right way, it fosters a community of learning where some students are helping other students learn, and that really makes them learn better. So one of the ways in which students retain information is to teach it to somebody else. And so when they can do that with another student in the classroom, and it's really seen as a collaborative effort, it helps everybody do better academically. Acceptance of others that are different than us is really, really important. And it's not necessarily something that's a subject matter that's taught in school like math or English, but when we have inclusion, we learn that it's okay to be different, that it's okay, you know, to have different characteristics from our classmates, and that that's kind of a strength that makes us part of a community, and it helps everybody to do well. And I think one of the ways in which research has really been great for inclusion is we're now figuring out that everybody does better academically when there's inclusion. Both students that are performing really well and students that are not, they all do better in an inclusive classroom instead of kind of segregating students. This is a great book that I would recommend everybody read. It's called The Difference by Scott Page. And he is a researcher that just, it's really great. So I'm going to read what it says here. It says, in terms of problem solving and making predictions, cognitive diversity will win over capacity. In these terms, diversity is just as important or more so than intelligence. Pretty much what he did is he compared different groups. One group that had really high-performing individuals, they were all the experts in their field, and they were doing really, really well, to another group who they were not the experts in their field, but they were a diverse group. So the majority of the times, the diverse group always outperformed the experts in the field when it came to problem solving and making predictions. And then he takes it a step further to say cognitive diversity. So not only is this saying like, oh, diversity in terms of, you know, people from different socioeconomic status or different ethnic groups, which is really, really important, but as well cognitive ability. So people with disabilities have unique traits and unique sets that they bring to the conversation. So when we include them in a group, especially in the workforce or in a classroom project, if we have the right tools to include them, they will solve the problem better. And it's kind of a hard idea to wrap our minds around because we think like an expert will always do the best job most of the time. His research really is proving that diverse groups do the best most of the time. And so when thinking about, do we want all of our children to do better, really diversity, including people with disabilities, is really important. So one of the ways, the most important way, the best tool to really have inclusion in the classroom is using the universal design for learning. And there's a lot of tools out there, a lot of videos, a lot of books that talk about this topic because it's super important. So the universal design for learning is the idea that education is for everyone, which we've talked about. And instruction can be given in various forms so that everyone can learn. Learning modes are not research-based. Everyone is an auditory, visual, kinesthetic learner, and everyone needs those displays. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So when I was growing up and when I was going to school, we always talked about, oh, there's different modes of learning. So one student is a visual learner, one student is an auditory learner, one student is a kinesthetic learner. So the research, the new research that has been coming up is that that is completely not true. What the research is telling us is that our brain is actually super interconnected. So we used to believe that one part of the brain took care of speech and language and another part of the brain took care of, you know, mathematical equations. And we're just finding that that is not true. So our brain is completely interconnected, that it works all together all the time. So there have been people that have had trauma, brain trauma, and you know, if it were true that, okay, only this part of the brain does this, then they would never be able to, you know, do whatever part of the brain that was damaged, do that task. So what we are learning now is that our brain is super plastic, like it works with each other. So students are not visual learners or auditory learners or kinesthetic learners. They may prefer one or over the other, such as you prefer a color, like I prefer red. It doesn't mean all of my learning medias have to be red or every display has to be red. So as educators, the way we can implement universal design for learning is to present the information in all of the ways to all of the students. So instead of saying this student is going to get, a visual way, this student is going to get an auditory way, let's present that to all of our students, and it will make for richer understanding of the materials. The next important thing about universal design for learning is thinking of all students in each phase of the learning, in the planning, in the materials, the instruction, and the assessment. So when doing our instruction, thinking, okay, knowing that all of our learners should be kinesthetic, and that's just a fancy way of saying moving their bodies. All of our learners need an auditory way and a visual way to learn. How can I do this lesson to incorporate all of those things? And also thinking of students with disabilities. Okay, I have a student with disabilities who has not really good fine motor skills. So what can I include so that they can access the curriculum and not do it at the end? So one of the problems with kind of doing materials for students with disabilities is we do the addition at the end of the lesson for the student with a disability. So make it a part of the lesson from the beginning. Plan in the beginning with students with disabilities in mind and what their needs are, and how it can be incorporated to be a part of everybody. So I work with blind students primarily, and I do a lot of tactile maps. So they can feel the map of whatever chart they're doing. Instead of just providing a tactile map to that one student, providing tactile maps to all of our students, because it's a way that everybody can learn, and it's another way of reinforcing the information. So that's kind of the idea about universal design for learning. And of course, adapting the physical space where learning will take place to make sure it's accessible to all of our students. So instead of thinking after the fact like, oh, now we have to change this part of our setting, thinking of it in the beginning when it's being planned out. Okay, so the next part is, as educators, what can we do specifically? Kind of all of these things that we've gone over. So the first thing we need to do is reflect on our perception of disability. Are we thinking about disability as something that's pitiful and something that's lesser than? And if we are, it's okay. We need to recognize it and say, okay, how can we move forward to kind of change that mentality? And I'm going to skip to the last point there. I think the best way to really change our ideas of how we think about disability is getting to know adults with disabilities. A lot of times educators, the only time we interact with other people with disabilities is with our students. And so we don't have a basis for what can a person with a disability do. What do they like to do for fun? How do they hang out with friends? And so it's really important that as educators, we make friendships with people with disabilities so that we know, oh, okay, it's not just something that I work with my students, but rather I have somebody I can ask when I have questions, and I have a mindset of how they can do certain things. So as educators, we can also use principles of universal design for learning, making everything accessible, providing all of the ways of learning from the beginning, making sure that every lesson includes every student. I think that's really important. A lot of times I hear teachers say, oh, well, this student isn't participating in this activity because they can't, because of their disability. And I say, let's take a step back. There's a way. There's always a way. Let's be creative about how they can do it. So an example is some kids were playing tag, and they were like, well, there's no way the blind student can play tag, because how are they going to know who's it? They're always going to get tagged. And how are they going to know the person's chasing them? So a student came up with a way. He brought a jar with rocks, and he said, if you're it, you have to shake the jar of rocks. And so that way I will know the person that's it all the time, and I can run away from them. And so it's something just very simple that he came up with, and now he can play tag with the rest of his friends, and it's something that's a small adaptation. So as educators, we need to be really, really creative about how our students can participate, and our students should never be sitting out of an activity. If everybody else is participating, we need to find a way, and it may not be the same exact way that other students are participating, but in a way that's meaningful, that they're getting the same amount of information out of the lesson. And then having high expectations for all of our students, I think, is really, really important. The idea of a bee or a flea, are we viewing our students as bees who can do, a lot more, or are we viewing them as fleas who, like, we're limiting what they can do? Okay, I have a couple of resources that are really helpful for this topic. So the website understood.org is a wonderful website. It's both in English and in Spanish. It has information for educators and parents on attention and learning difficulties. So I have found that this website works for a lot of different disabilities, because it has kits, it has a video that you can go through, it has a lot of information on how to incorporate learning with students with disabilities. The next resource is the INTEF. It's in Spanish. It's different modules, about 7 modules, that take you through what inclusion looks like and how you can incorporate it. So it's really, really useful. The last one I have is a kit on inclusion. And that one I would highly recommend downloading and printing out. So it walks you through basic steps to take in your classroom or in your school on how to make things accessible, and it problem solves with you. So you write down, like, okay, what's an issue you're having? Okay, what are the resources to find that we can bring together to solve the issue? So it's a really, really great resource that I would recommend people print and download in order to make their practices a little more inclusive. And so that is all I have.
Thank you so much, María Conchita, once again, for sharing your experience here, your knowledge on the topic. Now we are opening the floor for questions. So let me see the chat. I know we have some teachers and participants here typing down. Let's see if we have some questions. If not, please type them now on the chat. So I see. Okay, so Agnes and I see that also Gail, they just logged in and they were asking about the video availability. Yes, this webinar is being recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel and on our virtual community of practice, and this following link that you see on the screen. Yes, Patricia is asking about the PowerPoint presentation. We will have this presentation available also on our ITAN virtual community of practice on the same link that you see on your screen. I see that Laura Monecki, she's asking about how many students did you have in the class?
So the practice that we go off is 30%. So a good inclusive classroom will be 30% students with disabilities and 70% students without disabilities. When you do more than that, it becomes a classroom of students with disabilities, and when you do less than that, it becomes one student in the classroom. So a good practice is 30 to 70. And it depends, it might be a little more or a little less depending on the students. Like in the United States, we have IEPs, which are individual education plan. So any student that has an IEP is a student with a disability and is in the classroom, but it's normally 30-70 is the ideal number.
Thank you so much for the answer, María Conchita. So while we wait for other interventions from our participants, I'd like to ask you a question about your own experience with other members of the education community, because I know that parents, school directors, and other, like parts of the community are important, to encourage this inclusive perspective, in the classroom. So Could you please tell us about your experience on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Parents are vital in order to kind of bring together, and sometimes it can be difficult to incorporate parents into the education. If parents, a lot of parents are in the medical model of disability, and so they see their child as like, oh my God, we're so sad that our child has a disability, and really like, what can we do? And so I think the first step for parents is bringing them in and letting them know like it's going to be okay. Your child, you know, there's opportunities for your child. And in the last webinar, I was talking about, I kind of trick parents into coming to see me by I provide free food and free childcare to the parents, and have a meeting with them and be like, let's talk about what are some of the things that are your concerns with your child, and how we can address them at school. Because sometimes parents have real fears that aren't necessarily academic based. So they have a fear that like their child's never going to be able to live by themselves, or they have a fear that, you know, what's going to happen when they're not there anymore. So kind of going over those basic fears that parents have, and letting them know that, you know, it's going to be okay. As a school community, we're not just here to teach your child how to read and write, but also how to prepare your child for life, and that includes kind of looking at the whole child and the parent. Teachers and administration are also very important. At the beginning of every year, I try to have a professional development workshop for teachers that I'm going to be working with and administration, where they understand, okay, when you see a child with a disability going through the hall, this is how you interact. You know, we all want to have a positive philosophy on disability, because sometimes if I'm the only one being like, oh, it's great, you know, it's a characteristic and you're going to be fine, and then they meet another teacher who's like, oh, I'm so sorry, you know, you're in a wheelchair, then that's really sending mixed messages. So we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that everybody kind of wants to move towards this idea that disability is something that's a characteristic and it makes the student who they are, and that it you know, there are positive things about disability. And so making sure administration and parents are a part of that is really, really important.
Thank you so much, Maria Conchita. I see a question here by Paul Viteri. He is asking, what kind of disabilities do you think is good for that 30% when you were answering the first question?
I think all types of, so I think it depends on kind of a lot of different scenarios. I've seen it work with varying disabilities. So in some instances, this 30-70, if it's a more severe disability, I would say especially in early childhood. So early childhood, here we consider 3 to 5 years old. So in that age range, it's really important for them to get like all the resources that they need. So sometimes we have the 30-70 and 2 teachers in the classroom. Then when they move up and get out of early childhood, more in the elementary grades, then we do, you know, the 30-70 with 1 teacher in the classroom. But it depends on it. I've really seen it work with different disabilities. Like I specifically work with blind students. In the school that I work in, there is a classroom that has students with Down syndrome, students with mobility disabilities. So it really depends. And I would say it also depends on the resources that are available. So the ideal is to move towards inclusion as much as possible. And also understanding like what resources do we have available to us at the schools we're with. So I sometimes will try to educate the teacher. Like the teacher says, okay, I'm going to make my classroom inclusion and I want to make that work. So I will say, okay, let's focus on one disability that you are going to really learn a lot about, that you are going to be the expert in, and then you are able to take in 30% of kids with that disability so that you can really work with them better. Next year, you've done it it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be, you're learning. Next year, okay, so your students, you've gotten that. Now let's learn about a new disability. Okay, let's learn about Down syndrome. Okay, so now let's take, one student with Down syndrome and the other students with a disability that you know of. And so that way it's not like you're a new teacher and you're doing this 30-70 model with a lot of different disabilities and you know nothing about. So I would say go slow, become an expert in the disabilities that you really want to study. And I think becoming an expert is not only in the medical side of it, but also there's a lot of organizations that are run by people with a disability. So for example, for individuals that are blind, there's two big organizations in the United States. There's the National Federation of the Blind, there's the American Council of the Blind, there's also the World Blind Union. So those organizations are run by blind individuals. And so it's really important to become connected to those organizations. Like in autism, for example, there's the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, and they're a great resource for autism, and they are run by people with autism. So we need to reach out not only to the professionals in the field of like, this is how this is the medical side of it, but also people that have the disability and can provide you with the resources that worked for them.
Thank you, María Conchita. I see here another question. Agnes Rosemary Roberts, she's asking, do you have resources on assessment in the inclusive classroom?
Yes, but I'm not sure exactly what type of assessment, in what area are you looking for?
Okay, so while Agnes types that down, let's scroll down and see if there are other questions. Is the rights approach the best approach when the disabled students need acknowledgement and compassion? This question is by Gail Mohammed Oxley.
So if I understand your question correctly, it's about if the kind of empowerment model on disability is the appropriate choice kind of with compassion. And I think so. I think a lot of us who came into the field because we want to help others and we have kind of this compassion for other people. So I think there's a way of having both compassion and letting people make their own decisions. And sometimes, like, people tell me, their disability is so severe that they can't make their own decisions. And my response is, no matter how severe the disability, there's still some decisions people can make. So for example, a student who's nonverbal and who is also physically contained, how can they make their own decisions? Well, we can start off by small decisions, providing them with pictures of like, would you rather do this and this? And it might not be a big decision, but it's something small where they realize, I can make a decision. And that helps them kind of bring on bigger decisions. I think compassion is important, but also compassion can't be the center of everything, because if we're just building off of compassion, then we're kind of still on this idea of like, oh, I feel sorry for you. And so compassion is good, but we have to realize that it's a characteristic, and it's also something where we need to kind of empower people to feel good about kind of the way that they are.
Thank you. So going back to the question of Agnes, she says that medical, social, etc. assessment.
In an inclusive classroom?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. So we use one here that is a milestone assessment. So instead of it being like, this, like a student will do this and this and this, it's more of a range. So it's like social, emotional, physical, academic. It has all of these different sections, and I can send it to you. Yes. So that it can be added onto one of the resources. And so what it does is it takes a spectrum, because really no student is the same, even if they don't have disabilities. So it says, okay, where is the student at socially? So do they only interact with their parents? They interact with some adults. They interact with some students, but only if the student talks to them. And so it's a continuum, so it works really well with students with disabilities and varying disabilities because they're going to fall somewhere on this continuum, and the goal is to move them forward. So it's not to say, oh, they're so far behind because everybody else is, up front. It's saying, okay, this is where this student is, let's move them forward. So it doesn't matter what disability they have. So yes, I will send that assessment over.
Yeah, and we will make it available on our item virtual community of practice, where we're going to post the rest of the materials that supported.
And it might be a paid assessment. I'm just warning you because I think my school pays for it. So I'm not sure if it's free or not, but I will send it over.
Okay, thank you so much. Jacqueline Alvarez asks, I have 30 students in my class. They have different styles of learning. What can I do to find a good strategy for all of them?
Perfect. That's a great question. I actually have a chart that I meant to include that I didn't. So the easiest way to kind of lesson plan to make sure everything is working for all students is, I will send it over again. It's a basic lesson plan and making a list of like, okay, these are all the needs that my students have. Okay, now in making your lesson, okay, I'm going to be teaching about, 2 plus 2, for example. Okay, I'm going to be teaching 2 plus 2. Okay, let me look at the needs my student has. One of my students needs it, they like working with puzzles. Okay, I'm going to incorporate a puzzle. One of my students likes doing this. So it's kind of like a chart that you come up with, and you make a lesson. Are you going to do every single thing every single time? No, you're not. But the more you can incorporate and the more you can make as part of that learning, it'll be easier. One of the things I highly recommend is stations. So instead of, I'm going to be the teacher and I'm going to teach you, this is how we do it, I'm going to make a station. So for 3 minutes, I'm going to teach everybody the basic concept, and then we're going to break apart. So one station is going to have a puzzle that reinforces the idea of 2 plus 2. Another station is going to have an act out, because they need to move their bodies. We're going to act out with our bodies what 2 plus 2 looks like. Another station is going to have a writing out, writing out what does it look like. And so by stations, you give every student the ability to be kind of an expert in what works well for them. And you mix up the ability levels. So all the students with disabilities are not in the same group. They're mixed in with everybody else. And so you rotate. So you get 7 minutes in that station, and then you rotate. And so at the end of the lesson, you can assess them in different ways. You can say, okay, we are now going to, if you kind of really feel really good about this lesson, a thumbs up. If you're not really sure, a thumb to the side. And if you're definitely not good at it, a thumb down. And you get an idea of like, okay, what can I reinforce? But I would highly recommend stations. And then I will send the lesson plan. It's very quick and easy on incorporating all of the different ways of learning.
Thank you, Maria Conchita. Octavia Timothy asks, thinking of the 37 ratio, how ineffective can inclusion be if there is one child with a disability in a school?
Oh.
How effective, sorry. She says, no, ineffective.
And that's where it becomes complicated. So it's still effective for that student and that classroom. So let's say it's the one child and they're in the classroom. It's still going to help, in their classroom and everyone that they come across. I think it definitely opens up the idea of why is there only one student with a disability? Are we not letting students with disabilities become a part of our school? Or do we have other students with disabilities that we're not identifying? I think it's still beneficial, even if it's just one student in the classroom. Normally, the idea is, we have a lot of kids with disabilities, and so how many it works better. So no more than 36% to make it, reasonable for the educators and everybody else in the classroom. But it's still beneficial, even if it's that one student, because they're still interacting with their peers are still interacting with them. So it's still, even if it's not exactly 30-70, it still works.
Thank you, Maria Conchita. Earlier, Gail Mohammed Oxley commented this. I used a multidisciplinary approach to teaching pupils in the mainstream classroom. The need to small classes became required. A resource room was developed where pupils will go for specific times and work.
Mm-hmm.
That's also another good strategy.
And that's and I think that's very common, and it's definitely not a bad thing. We do it at our school, and it's definitely coming up with when is the right time to do that. So having a resource room where students go to like work on that, maybe the heavy writing, the heavy math, and then having them be a part of their class for lunch, recess, social skills, for everything else, is a good model as well. It doesn't have to look like 100% inclusion 100% of the time in the classroom. The model we go off of is in the classroom to the best extent possible. So that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes the student needs one-on-one support by a specialist who can sit down and be like, okay, we're going to go over basic structure. So a resource room is definitely a great thing if you have it at your school. And it's also making sure, though, that they're not 100% of the day in the resource classroom. So making sure they're interacting with their peers at lunch, at recess, during, like, we have art, we have music, we have different specials. So making sure during that time that they're interacting with their peers. But definitely a resource room can be a great thing as well.
Thank you, Maria Conchita. Once again, I'd like to share with you this slide where you can find Maria Conchita's email address and also follow her on Twitter. So if questions you still have or comments or anything that you'd like to discuss with her, you can address them directly using these means. We still have 4 minutes left for more questions or comments. But if we do not have any, I'd like to thank once again Maria Conchita for accepting this invitation. And of course, you, the participants, because without you, this initiative wouldn't be possible. Thank you so much for your time, for your comments, for sharing the experiences that you have here.
Yeah, one of the questions from the last webinar was kind of how do we get ideas on how to modify curriculum? The best resource that I have found is Pinterest. Pinterest, so many great educators are on there from all over the world, and they share their, classroom bulletins, their centers, their modified lessons. And so I would highly recommend going there. Another resource that's really, really good is called Teachers Pay Teachers. And it's teacherspayteachers.com, I believe, and you sign up, you make an account, and you can, if you make something that's really, really great, you can sell it on the site, or you can give it for free. So I download lessons from there that have to do with universal design for learning. I download a lot of different things, and it's free or it's a charge. And so you decide, like, okay, is this a really good resource that I want to pay for, or is it something that I can get for free? So Teachers Pay Teachers is a great resource.
Thank you, Maria Conchita. We're receiving a lot of thanks and greetings from our participants, such as Laura Monecki saying thank you for sharing with us such an interesting issue, and also Garrett Sutherland saying thank you for the information. We also have here Garrett Sutherland, yes, it was a good presentation. Patricia Annette, thank you. Really appreciate the time, and of course, like the depth and description of this issue that is really important in the education field. I think we're gonna start like wrapping up and saying goodbye to our participants because we're reaching the time. And as I said, the materials used for this webinar that include the synopsis, the PowerPoint presentation, Patricia Annette, thank you. Really appreciate the time, and of course, like the depth and description of this issue that is really important in the education field. I think we're gonna start like wrapping up and saying goodbye to our participants because we're reaching the time. And as I said, the materials used for this webinar that include the synopsis, the PowerPoint presentation, and the recording of the webinar will be made available on our virtual community of practice, and the link that you see on your screens now. And also the video recording will be available on our YouTube channel, which is Riet Aitan. And these materials will be available, if not by the end of this week, early next week.